It was the summer of 2023, off the coast of Alaska, and a small research boat sat completely still on flat, gray water. Nobody on board was speaking. A hydrophone dangled beneath the hull, and next to it, the underwater speaker waited to be switched on. The scientists were about to attempt something that had never been tried before in the history of marine biology, playing back a recorded whale call into open water, aimed at the very whale who made it, and waiting to see if she would answer. The recording was barely a day old. It had been captured nearby, in the same patch of ocean where a small pod was slowly moving, feeding, and surfacing to breathe. Among them was a 38-year-old humpback named Twain, a whale researchers had followed for years and knew by her markings. The sound about to be played back was her own contact call, the closest thing humpbacks have to saying, "I'm here, where are you?" When the speaker clicked on and that call rippled out into the cold water, the crew held their breath. Seconds passed. Then Twain rose to the surface, turned, and swam directly toward the boat. She began circling it, and then she opened her mouth and answered. Not once. Every time the scientist replayed the call, she replied again, in her own voice, as if a conversation had truly begun. The exchange lasted nearly 20 minutes. Call and response, call and response. How she answered. Every time the humans played their sound, they left a pause, mimicking the natural rhythm of humpback conversation. And every single time, Twain waited for that pause to end before responding, never talking over the signal, never rushing. She was taking turns. She understood the rhythm of dialogue itself. For most of recorded history, whale sounds were assumption in real time, in front of witnesses, on camera. This wasn't a laboratory simulation or a computer model. It was a wild 38-year-old animal choosing, again and again, to answer a specific human-made sound with her own voice, on a rhythm that matched the conversational timing whales use with each other. If a whale can recognize the shape of a pause and know precisely when to fill it, then the sounds beneath the waves are doing something far more sophisticated than anyone outside a small circle of specialists had previously accepted. That moment in Alaska did not come out of nowhere. It was the visible tip of a much larger, stranger story that had been quietly building for almost a decade, one that would eventually convince a team of MIT, Harvard, and Berkeley scientists that whales were not just making noise in the dark, they were speaking something. Whales was almost absurdly easy. Crews harpooned pod after pod with barely any resistance. Then, within roughly 2.5 years, something strange happened. Successful hunts dropped by nearly 58%. The whales hadn't disappeared, they had learned. Survivors from early attacks appeared to pass a warning through the population, and that warning didn't stay local. Whales thousands of miles away, who had never seen a harpoon or a hunting ship, began changing their behavior anyway. Historian Bathsheba DeMuth, who studied whaling logs from that era at Brown University, found entries where hunters themselves wrote that the animals seemed to be talking to each other, coordinating, learning from encounters they personally never witnessed. Something was clearly moving through the ocean, faster than any ship could travel, and it wasn't sonar. It was sound. Whaling captains left behind another detail that quietly troubled them for enough to say for certain. The truth is, those questions sat unanswered for nearly 2 centuries. The modern chapter of this story really begins in a quiet hallway at Harvard's Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. Marine biologist David Gruber was in his office, headphones on, replaying old hydrophone recordings he had originally collected while studying bioluminescent life in the Caribbean. Buried in that audio were sharp, rhythmic, clicking sounds that he had heard many times and always dismissed as background noise, the ocean equivalent of static. On this particular day, Shafira Goldwasser, a cryptographer from MIT best known for her work on encryption, happened to be walking past. She caught a few seconds of the recording and stopped in her tracks. To her trained ear, it didn't sound like static at all. It sounded like a code, sequences of short and long pulses, not unlike Morse code. She asked Gruber a simple question that changed the direction of his entire career. Had anyone ever tried running this through machine learning? Nobody had. For all the decades whale researchers had spent recording these sounds, no one had approached them the way a codebreaker would, looking not for meaning, but for hidden structure. That single hallway conversation planted the seed for what would become one of the most ambitious interspecies communication projects ever attempted. In 2020, that seed became Project CETI, short for the Cetacean Translation Initiative, a collaboration pulling in researchers from MIT, Harvard, Berkeley, and roughly a dozen other institutions. The mission sounded almost like science fiction. Use artificial intelligence, the same category of deep learning behind modern chatbots, to decode what sperm whales are actually saying to one another. AI researcher Misha, sperm whale families return there every year. These weren't anonymous animals passing through. Researchers already knew their family structures, had named their matriarchs, and had mapped years of social relationships between different clans. It was, in effect, a whale neighborhood the scientists had already spent years getting to know. Into that neighborhood, they lowered hydrophone arrays, networks of underwater microphones that recorded constantly, capturing which whale said what and when. They also developed suction cup biologging tags fitted with 3 separate microphones, allowing the team to isolate individual voices even when several whales clicked at once, while simultaneously tracking depth, temperature, GPS position, and the whale's own body movements down to small shifts and turns. It wasn't just a recording system. It was a system built to capture the entire social and physical context surrounding every single click, so an algorithm could later stitch sound and situation back together. Alongside the underwater hardware, the team also built camera-carrying drones to observe surface behavior at the exact moment a coda was recorded, and cross-referenced years of genealogical records the Dominica Field Station had already compiled, tracking which whales were related to which, and which clans tended to avoid each other entirely. Some of these clans, researchers discovered, share the same waters for years without ever exchanging a single coda, almost like neighboring communities that speak mutually unintelligible dialects and simply don't interact. Layering genealogy, drone footage, movement data, and raw acoustics together is what finally gave the machine learning models enough context to start noticing patterns that had been sitting in decades of prior recordings completely unexamined. Roughly 9,000 recordings were eventually fed into the AI models. What came back overturned assumptions that had stood for decades. Researchers had long believed sperm whales used a fixed vocabulary of about 21 distinct click patterns, called codas, each functioning almost like a traffic signal, a small closed set of fixed meanings. The AI found 156. That number alone startled the team, but the deeper surprise was that these codas weren't rigid signals at all. Each one could be modified along 4 separate dimensions simultaneously. Tempo, meaning how quickly or slowly the clicks arrived. Rhythm, meaning the spacing between individual clicks. Ornamentation, extra clicks inserted that shifted the overall meaning, similar to adding a modifying word into a sentence. And rubato, tiny timing variations that appeared to carry something like emotional color, the acoustic equivalent of a voice tightening with stress or softening with calm. Combined, these 4 variables meant whales weren't limited to a small fixed menu of signals. They could combine and recombine a small set of basic building blocks into what looked like an open-ended communication system, a property linguists call duality of patterning, previously believed to exist only in human language. An MIT researcher on the project reportedly stared at the results for a long moment before saying only that this should not be possible. Then the AI flagged, something even harder to explain away. The same individual whale would alter how it communicated depending on who it was speaking to, a phenomenon researchers call audience design. Just as a person naturally speaks differently to a child than to a colleague, or softens their tone around someone who's grieving, these whales appeared to adjust their vocal patterns based on the listener. That kind of adaptation requires more than memorized signals. It implies some model of what the other individual might be thinking or feeling, something researchers cautiously connect to what psychologists call theory of mind, the capacity to recognize that another creature has its own internal perspective. For decades, that capacity was treated as a hallmark of advanced human cognition. Seeing hints of it in the clicking patterns of an animal separated from us by tens of millions of years of evolution was not something most of the CETI team expected to find. Sperm whales also seem to understand uncomfortably well when they are being listened to. Researcher Oscar Curtis Palacios and his team were tracking a pod of 25 sperm whales near the Galapagos Islands using underwater microphones. For nearly 2 weeks, everything proceeded normally, ordinary clicking, ordinary movement, steady data. Then, in what researchers described as a single moment rather than a gradual fade, all 25 whales went completely silent at once and left the area. No slow tapering off, no partial withdrawal, just immediate, total silence followed by departure. The most unsettling interpretation offered was that the group had detected the presence of the recording equipment and coordinated a shared response, essentially choosing, together, to stop being overheard. If that interpretation holds, it means whales understood they were under observation well before humans understood a single word of what they were saying. Even the way whales learn their own communication mirrors human infancy in an eerie way. Baby sperm whales are not born fluent. Like human infants babbling before their first real words, calves produce broken, inconsistent click patterns and slowly refine them through repetition, usually in total darkness, while their mothers are away on deep hunting dives. The very first structured pattern a calf typically masters is what researchers call an identity coda, a signature click sequence that identifies which family or clan it belongs to, functionally similar to a surname. In other words, before a young sperm whale learns anything about hunting, navigating, or survival, the first thing it learns is who it belongs to. Around the same time these coda patterns were being mapped, a linguist working separately from the coda research took a different approach entirely. Instead of just cataloging click sequences, researcher Gaspar Begusch slowed those recordings down and studied their acoustic shape in far greater detail. What he found added an entirely new layer to the story. Buried inside these clicks were what appeared to be vowel-like formant structures, sounds with the same acoustic fingerprints as human vowels. His team identified something resembling an A sound, close to the vowel in father, and something resembling an I sound, close to the vowel in C. They also detected what looked like diphthongs, sounds that glide from one vowel quality into another mid-pulse, the same way the word boy slides from one vowel sound into the next. Begusch was careful to note that earlier generations of researchers treated these clicks as something closer to Morse code, simple on-off pulses with no internal texture. What his acoustic analysis revealed instead behaved more like slowed-down vowels, structured resonances, not just binary blips. This finding is strange precisely because sperm whales have no business producing anything resembling vowels. Human vowel production depends on a very specific anatomical toolkit, a larynx positioned low in the throat, precise coordinated movement of the tongue and jaw, and a resonating vocal tract shaped to filter sound into distinct tones. Sperm whales possess none of this. Their entire sound-producing anatomy evolved for something completely different, echolocation, the same principle bats use to navigate in darkness, bouncing sound off objects to build a mental map of their surroundings. Yet somehow, sound produced by an anatomical system built purely for navigation is showing acoustic properties associated with structured language. Scientists refer to this kind of outcome as convergent evolution, when two species with completely unrelated evolutionary paths independently stumble onto strikingly similar solutions. Humans built vocal cords for talking. Whales built a sonar system for hunting in the dark. And somewhere in that sonar system, something language-shaped appears to have emerged anyway. The organ responsible for all of this is almost as strange as the discovery itself. Inside a sperm whale's enormous head sits the spermaceti organ, paired with structures called phonic lips and an elaborate nasal passage system, all working together to generate both echolocation clicks and, apparently, these subtler patterned sounds. This is also the same system capable of producing one of the loudest sounds any living creature can make. A sperm whale's most powerful click can reach roughly 230 decibels underwater. For comparison, a jet engine sits around 140 decibels, and human hearing begins sustaining damage well before 150. Divers who have been close to a vocalizing sperm whale have described feeling pressure in their chest and numbness in their limbs, sensations produced purely by the force of the sound moving through water and tissue. Marine journalist James Nestor documented an account of a diver whose hand went numb for nearly 4 hours after a whale's click passed through his body at close range. It is a genuinely strange fact of biology that the same organ capable of generating something close to a physical shockwave is also, apparently, capable of producing darkness and distance. If that interpretation holds even loosely, it means sperm whales may have been repeating some version of this same simple signal to each other for millions of years, long before any human boat ever crossed their path, and long before anyone was listening closely enough to notice. None of this exists in a vacuum from the animals' emotional lives either. Shane Yarrow, who has spent more than a decade following individual sperm whale families in Dominica, has documented behavior that reads less like biology and more like family life. He has watched a mother click briefly with another adult female before diving away to hunt for food, leaving her calf under the group's watch, a pattern that looks remarkably like asking someone else to look after your child while you're away. He has also documented young whales interacting the way children do, nudging each other gently, clicking back and forth, sometimes for stretches lasting close to an hour, taking turns, occasionally overlapping, sometimes loud and sharp, sometimes soft. Patterns that read like play, correction, and reassurance layered together. This isn't a handful of isolated clicks. It's sustained, socially organized interaction passed between individuals who clearly recognize each other as distinct, ongoing relationships, rather than anonymous members of a herd. It's worth being careful here about exactly what has and hasn't been established. No research team has produced a verified word-for-word translation of a complete whale sentence the way we might translate a line of French or Japanese. What Project CETI and related research groups have documented is H on its own. Whales adjusting their tone based on who's listening, calves learning identity before anything else, entire pods going silent the instant they sense they're being recorded, and sound waves that behave almost like human vowels despite being produced by an organ built for sonar, not speech. Other cetaceans complicate and enrich this picture even further. Bottlenose dolphins are known to develop individual signature whistles, essentially names they use for each other, and remarkably, Dolphins have been recorded remembering and responding to the signature whistle of a former tank mate more than 20 years after they were separated, one of the longest documented social memories in any non-human animal. Humpback whale song, a completely separate communication channel from the click-based codas of sperm whales, evolves and spreads. Within family pods, dialects so consistent that researchers can often identify which specific family group a pod belongs to purely from its call patterns. No visual sighting required. And some orca populations have even been documented picking up new hunting techniques and passing them down culturally, generation to generation, independent of anything encoded in their genes. None of these systems are identical to human. Has increased dramatically over the past century, and that rising background noise is already known to interfere with how whales communicate over long distances, forcing some populations to call louder, shift frequencies, or simply fall silent in noisy corridors. Knowledge and structure that took millions of years to develop before scientists ever get the chance to fully decode it. There is also a deeper, more uncomfortable question sitting underneath all of this data. For most of human history, we defined ourselves partly by what we assumed no other creature could do: string small building blocks into new meanings, adjust our tone for a specific listener, pass down an identity to our children before we teach them anything else. If generational family units for decades, teaching, learning, and apparently talking the entire time, largely undisturbed by anything we understood until an AI model was finally pointed at 9,000 recordings and asked to look for a pattern. None of this means the mystery is solved. Researchers on Project CETI and in related labs are careful, almost stubbornly careful, not to claim they've produced a verified whale to English dictionary. What they will say is that the assumptions holding up the old picture, 21 fixed codas, no flexible grammar, no real audience awareness, have not survived contact with better data and better models. Each new recording season adds more codas, more variation, more evidence of structure where scientists once expected only noise. Whether the full picture eventually includes something we could fairly call a sentence, a warning, or even a message aimed at humanity is still an open question, one that will likely take years, possibly decades, of continued recording and modeling to answer honestly. What began as a strange coincidence in a Harvard hallway, a marine biologist half ignoring old recordings and a cryptographer recognizing a pattern in the noise, has grown into one of the most consequential open questions in modern science. Are whales, in some limited but genuine sense, actually talking to each other using something structurally similar to language? The honest answer right now is that the evidence increasingly points toward yes, while the full content of what they're saying, and whether any of it is truly meant as a message for us rather than for each other, remains stubbornly, tantalizingly out of reach. And somewhere underneath that uncertainty sits a quieter, more sobering fact. The ships, sonar, and industrial noise we keep adding to their world may be drowning out exactly the kind of subtle, structured communication researchers are only just learning to recognize, meaning we could end up losing pieces of this conversation before we ever fully understand what was being said. For 30 million years in total darkness, something down there has been speaking. And we are only now, for the very first time, starting to learn how to listen, and we may not have as much time left to finish that education as we would like to think.